undoubtedly the best data-focused fantasy football writer on the internet. So if you guys
watch everyone leave right now.
Yeah.
Everyone's just going to be like, nah, forget it. No JJ.
Well, if you want to win more fantasy games this year, follow him on Twitter, Late Round QB. Definitely encourage you to do that. So I'm Adam. I'm the COO of numberFire and Director of Technology, Revenue, and Operations at FanDuel. My experience is enterprise sales, business development, revenue generation, marketing, operations, that sort of stuff. I hooked up with these guys about a little over 3 years ago. At the time, numberFire was a startup with a small audience, not much revenue to speak of. And if you fast forward to now, we serve millions of customers a month. We do millions a year in revenue. And in August 2015, we were acquired by FanDuel, which we're all really excited about. So enough from me. Now that the table's kind of set here, kick it over to the guys who are way more talented than I am. So Keith, you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. And Adam actually literally started from the bottom back when he joined. He joined like a couple days before this conference, back in like 2013 or so, and he was literally sleeping on the floor in our room.
Yeah, we were sharing rooms, so I get a bed this year. That's a good thing.
It's really more of a cot.
Well,
Murphy bed.
who's keeping track, right?
Yeah.
So my background is I was a math major at Northwestern. I didn't really even know that sports analytics was a viable career path until I read Michael Lewis's book, not Moneyball, but The Blind Side, where in it there was a study about how passing was much more efficient than rushing in the NFL. And this guy, Ben Alamar, who's at this conference, he's speaking and he works for ESPN now, had done this study, and it was something that I had always believed about passing being better than rushing in today's NFL, but I never thought about using math to prove it. So as an undergrad, I interned for a couple of different NBA franchises, and I worked at ESPN for a summer, and then I actually met Nik here at MIT in 2011. We were in a room like this, although it was empty at the time. He was wearing like a Nordiques jersey or something like that, and really had just started the company and approached me about taking over the data portion of it, and that's kind of how I got set up with numberFire and made it to here.
Yeah, I'm Nik. I founded and am the CEO of numberFire, and I'm the vice president of something or other at FanDuel. So how I started numberFire, the idea was, I'm probably just like everyone else in this room. I play like tons of fantasy sports. And I was in a pretty serious league, a bunch of my old fraternity brothers from Carnegie Mellon. And every week I'd have the same problems. Who do I start? Do I start this guy? Who do I draft? That sort of thing. But at the time, a lot of the content that was focused on fantasy sports was super qualitative, right? It was, I think this, or, oh, you guys should go with that. It was all driven from the gut. And that didn't make sense to me because my background's in computer science, like most people who end up starting internet companies. And it didn't make sense to me that all the data that was collected meticulously around sports, and there was new APIs to access that information, and yet all the content and all the writing in the support system that was there for fantasy players was still super qualitative. And so you had this Moneyball revolution that was going on in sports, but it was solely within the front offices. The Moneyball revolution never got extended to the consumer. And so I was like, well, geez, why can't you do the same kind of analysis and just say, hey, fantasy player, you should do this, and here's the reasons why. So that was really the genesis of starting numberFire. Unfortunately, I come from a relatively modest background in Pittsburgh, and my dad's a steelworker, so it's not like I come from a lot of money. So I didn't have the resources to really start numberFire until I was on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire with Regis Philbin. I ended up winning $100,000 in prime time on ABC. And Regis is like 5'3", and so I'm 6'5". So if you guys go on YouTube, there's a great clip of me dancing with Regis.
Indeed.
It's very gift-worthy, I'll say that. And so I use that to start the company, and using the phrase "started from the bottom," and that's really where we started from. It started from just an idea that I had. I built the first product, and then the way you need to think about startups is you think about it as a ladder, right? You start at the bottom of the ladder, and at the top of it, you might see Mark Zuckerberg, but you're not going to go straight to the top of the ladder. You have to work your way up. And so that means that you have to find talented people to work with. You have to build a product. You have to hustle. You have to make partnerships. In our case, we got into an accelerator program. We raised VC capital. And you have to just kind of do step by step to work your way up. It's funny that it probably would never have happened if I was never on a game show. So to everyone out there who's looking for some financing for a company, look at game shows. That's probably the real key takeaway from this. Jeopardy was probably good. I don't know if Wheel of Fortune will give you enough, but be creative.
Nick also left out one really key part of the story, which is that in order to get into the hot seat, he had to win the fastest fingered question, and it was about the order of the Twilight books or something like that. So he got it right and in the fastest time in order to get on the show.
Yeah, I am, Keith.
So pivoting from Twilight, I get the sense that there might be some students in the audience, and Keith, I know they may be interested in what prompted you to choose to work at a startup like numberFire instead of working for a team in a front office, which I know that that's a goal of yours.
Yeah, so there was a couple of different things that went into my decision when I was coming out of school. The first was that I didn't know anything about the startup world, and I was kind of intrigued about learning about how to build a business and raise funding and that kind of stuff. And I felt like just coming out of college, if there was ever a time to take a big risk with a startup, that was the time to do it, whereas I could always go back and try to get a job with a team. So that was one of the reasons. Another part of it was that I was, at the time, very nervous that if I worked for a team, when analytics weren't that embraced within the organization, that I wouldn't really have control over what I'm working on. And whereas with numberFire, I kind of got to pick what I thought was important, the projects that were the most interesting, and I got to work across sports as well. So kind of having that freedom to work on what I thought was most interesting was another reason that I decided to join numberFire. When you're kind of thinking about it, there's basically three areas that you can join in the analytics community. One is if you're actually doing the sports analytics portion of it. One is working with a team. One is working in the media, which is what I would consider what I do. The third is working in academia. And the difference is kind of the core focus of what you're working on. So if you're working with a team, every single project that you're working on is geared towards how can I help this team win? How can I help them win one more game? How can I help them make the playoffs? How can I help them win a championship? So that's from salary cap analysis to predicting how amateur players are going to perform through the draft, all that kind of stuff. When you're working in the media and in academia, you're really talking about what's most interesting to consumers. In the media, we want to know how are we going to get people to come back? How can we build useful and interesting tools that people are going to want to use? And the third section, academia, again, it's what's interesting, but a lot of it is more geared towards kind of developing new groundbreaking statistical methods. And a lot of it isn't necessarily that useful in terms of the topic. The number of like BCS ranking papers I've seen or college basketball ranking papers where, yeah, it can be a very interesting concept, but no team is going to look at that and find that extremely useful. It's just a different trajectory. And in joining numberFire, what I really wanted to do was take the approach of the team, which was my background, as far as how can we understand teams and players better so that we could help a team win, but apply it to kind of the media section. And that's kind of the whole foundation for the data that we do at numberFire.
Yeah, and I'll take the same question like from a slightly different tack. So Keith comes from the math world. I come from the computer science world. So to the EC guy, the ECE guys out there, the CS guys, I think that when you graduate, obviously tech, there's going to be a lot of opportunities out there. When I graduated, there was a lot of people who were my peers at CMU were going to Google, they're going to Yahoo, they're going to Apple. And I even did that for 2 years. And I quickly realized that, that's the kind of job you want to take when you're like 40 and have 2 kids and a mortgage, right? Because, it's a nice job, it's stable, you get like free gym and free food and stuff like that, but there's no upside there. And, you might do interesting work, but, you're in a team of 150,000 or whatever it is, and you're not gonna have the impact that you would otherwise have if you join a startup. Now, obviously everyone's risk threshold is gonna be different, so joining a startup isn't necessarily economically or to everyone's particular threshold for risk. But, it's certainly something that has a lot of upside, and it has the potential for you to learn and be exposed to a lot of different technologies, a lot of different skills that you otherwise wouldn't have. So if you join a company like the big tech companies, you're going to be very, very narrow focused into one technology on one team doing one task, and that's that. Whereas, if you join a startup, Keith here is probably our second best engineer, and he started not knowing any code at all. And, my background, like I said, is computer science, but I was actually basically our lead designer for the entire time of numberFire until recently. And so, you learn a myriad of skills, which in the end will make you much more attractive to a variety of jobs. Because not only have you showed you have a myriad of skills, but you also learn project management skills, you also learn just the business side of it because you're dealing with VCs, you're dealing with like corporate partners and so on. And so, I definitely want people to think of startups and think of, using analytics in an entrepreneurial sense. It's obviously cool to work with the teams, and it's obviously cool to work with large media companies like the ESPNs of the world, but there is a relatively robust ecosystem for sports startups. There are specific VC firms that specifically invest in sports, invest in media companies, which is essentially what numberFire is. And so it's not as hard as you think it is as far as doing it, right? Really, the only barrier is you just deciding you want to do it, and then having the tenacity to hustle your ass off until you kind of work your way up the ladder.
So I'm sure a lot of people are curious for both of you, but we'll start with Nick. Nick, what are some of the biggest challenges with building a big data startup?
Yeah, I mean, really the biggest challenge for me was, the first part was getting off the ground, right? Building a big data company requires you to have data, right? To get access to it, to figure out how to get it, to do something useful with it. So you can't start a company unless you have some unique ability to turn that data into something interesting, right? So there's obviously the sort of the product side of it, which is difficult. It is a grind to actually raise money and to try to figure out how you're going to make an actual business out of this. There are a lot of startups that focus on growth, and like the Snapchats of the world. numberFire probably had more revenue in 2015 than Snapchat did, right? And so, but that's changing macroeconomically in the startup world, where companies with large growth but very weak revenue potential just aren't as fundable as they used to be. And so there's going to be a challenge for you to figure out, all right, well, first I got to find this cool technology or a cool way of looking at data. The second part of it is, how do I take that data and figure out a way to package it that someone might be willing to pay money for it? And so, whether that's working enterprise, B2B with companies like ESPN or NBC or the NFL or whatever, where that's going straight to the consumer and figuring out, all right, do I build a media business and monetize it through large amounts of traffic that I can sell ads around, or do I monetize it through a subscription product, which is mostly what numberFire is? You have to figure out a way to actually get a cogent business model out of it. And then from there, you kind of just have to figure out, as you grow, how do you maintain some of the strict standards that, on hiring, on product, and et cetera. And then eventually, how do you get out of it, right?
So I can speak to two big challenges that face kind of all big data companies, not necessarily just startups. And the first is anyone here who has worked with data knows the data management and collecting is the most tedious part of anything you do. So pulling the data in, cleaning it, and then storing it in an efficient manner so that you can later retrieve that data takes the majority of your time when you're working on this kind of stuff. And the difference between a startup and a big company is that a big company usually have people dedicated to each one of those jobs. You have one person who's in charge of database management and one person who's in charge of writing scripts to clean up the data. Whereas with a startup, you end up having one person who has to do all of those jobs. So as Nick said, I had no computer science background whatsoever, but because it was such a small company, you're forced to wear a lot of hats. So I had to learn how to do database management and set up the proper structures, and I had to learn how to make scripts to clean the data, and I had to learn how to scrape different websites, because the other problem is with a big company, you have the resources to pay for data feeds, which can be extremely expensive. But in a small company, you don't necessarily have those resources, so you have to make good use of being able to scrape publicly available data. So that's something that I highly recommend learning how to do, is scrape websites, because then you can build a data source for yourself.
This is why when people scrape the hell out of numberFire, I don't really get mad. I kind of get mad, but I've been there. So if you want to scrape our stuff, just let me know. We'll give you, better yet, we'll give you an API. Just don't resell it.
We're not gonna give out an API, so.
The
yeah. I just got overruled.
the second big challenge, which again is for kind of all data companies, and it's the same as when you're working for a team, is how do you communicate really high level math and really technical details to people who might not have that technical background. So if you're working with a team, the example is you're talking to a general manager or a coach who is an extremely smart person, especially about the sport that you're talking about, but they don't have the math or technical background that you may have. So the biggest challenge there is, how do you communicate with them? I've heard horror stories of people just putting a pile of spreadsheets down in front of them and saying, here's the research that I did. And that's the worst possible thing you can do. There's things in data visualization that can be extremely helpful, although if you're showing too much, that can be overwhelming. And it really comes down to kind of speaking the same language and looking at it from their point of view. And so all the tools and content that we write is we look at everything from the side of how would a user view this and how can they best understand it. So that's really what the whole content division of numberFire is taking the math models and trying to convey that information in an efficient manner.
Yeah, so with that, I'll put on my JJ hat. So one of the big sort of learnings that we had was, maybe around 2010 or so, we realized we had like a really cool product and that people were interested in what we were doing and the insights that our platform was generating. People seemed to think it was cool, but we just weren't getting the traffic. We weren't reaching an audience the way we thought we were. We basically kind of realized, and it seems sort of intuitive now, but we didn't know it at the time, that people just didn't want to come to our website and see a bunch of data tables, right? Like, basketball reference already exists, fan graphs already exist. Like, people don't want to see a derivation of that. They want that data to be ported into something that they can actually, approach and share with their friends and really wrap their head around. And the way to do that is to figure out a editorial and narrative voice for that data. The entire time from when I started numberFire until that point, I thought of data and content being kind of two separate buckets, right? They weren't really the same thing, but they actually are the same thing. Your data is your content. And once you realize that you need to wrap a sort of narrative voice around it, and we brought on JJ brought on a bunch of really talented writers that could look at that same data set that was being generated by our platform and write a narrative around it and be pithy and be funny and break it down so you don't have to look at the data table yourself and kind of figure it out, but the article breaks it down for you. It still can be super high quality content. It's referencing the data, it's based on the data, but it doesn't have to be as sort of mentally onerous as sorting through a spreadsheet yourself. And so once we sort of made that choice to kind of become a more traditional media company, that's when we went from something like, I don't know, like 50,000 uniques a month to right now we're at like something close to, I don't know, 1 million. I don't know what it is. But the point is, content is kind of the key component to a lot of companies, because once you have content that allows you to move beyond where you're at onto social media, onto Facebook, onto devices and places where people live or are consuming content. And that's really the way you need to approach it. So you need to stop thinking of data and content as being separate ideas and figure out a go-to-market, a go-to-audience strategy for that data. Because people are insatiable for fantasy sports content. They're insatiable for information about the teams they care about. I mean, I'm a Steelers fan. I could read a million Steelers articles all day, every day, as long as each one is telling me something different. And the advantage of having data and regressing it and looking at it for cool information is that you're always coming up with different ideas and different ways of looking at it. A lot of these sort of, Bleacher Report style content, like the very qualitative content, that has its purpose, but it's likely not going to tell you something different on Bleacher Report than they might tell you on Rand Sports, or they might tell you on SB Nation or some other super qualitative site. When you have the data and have the ability to do cool stuff with it, you're almost guaranteed to look at it from a different angle and come up with different insights, and that's really what's going to make you stand out. And unless you have a cogent narrative strategy around it, you're kind of just shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, without you can do all the data, you can use all the data and do all the analysis in the world, but if you can't convey that information properly, then it's all useless.
Okay, cool. So we've got about 10 minutes left. Want to leave some time for questions. So let's kind of turn the conversation a little bit. What do you guys see as exciting stuff happening in the world of sports analytics and media?
Yeah, well, you can tell by this conference, there's two main areas that I see that are kind of ripe for the picking right now. The first is all the player tracking data that's going on. You see it in the NBA with SportView, and stuff starting to happen in the NFL with Zebra and a couple other instances. And it's just this huge new data set to look at where you can start pulling out information about how to quantify defense, which has never really been done before, and using machine learning techniques to try to identify plays. And that's a huge area where it will help tremendously with the QC staff in football and general scouting, so that it will cut down using that automation. It'll cut down on the game prep time. And then once you combine that with the efficiency data on top of being able to recognize plays in an efficient manner, that's really kind of the next level as far as the player tracking data is concerned. And the second area that I think is really big is the whole physical science, where there's been tons of panels and talks at this conference already about kind of the physiology behind it, and how can we take all this mass amounts of data that we're gathering through GPS and through heart rate monitors and actually make use of it through trying to prevent injuries, trying to get the most out of these world-class athletes. Stuff that I haven't seen a lot on is how to maximize nutrition and stuff like that to get the best performance from your athletes. So I think those are two areas where people are now consuming large amounts of data, and it'll be interesting to see the types of analysis that come from it.
Yeah, I have a non-sexy answer for the first one. I think, from a technology perspective, I think infrastructure is going to be super important moving forward. You see companies like StatsInc and Sports Radar really doubling down and tripling down on their technology. because they realize that the more data gets spread out throughout the sports ecosystem, the more valuable that data becomes. And so, again, if you're a CS person, ECE person, like a backend person, there is a lot of opportunity for you to figure out a lot of that infrastructure of how to disseminate that data, or even help people set up like scraping as a service or something like that. The reality is numberFire as what it is couldn't have existed 10 years ago because the information wasn't as disseminated and APIs weren't available, and concurrently grid computing wasn't where it needed to be able to compute that large data set with any sort of efficiency. So, if numberFire couldn't exist 10 years ago, and it took companies like AccuScore and Team Rankings to sort of be the version 1.0 of what we became, and if we were kind of the 2.0, there's going to be some company that's the 3.0, the 4.0, that is really looking at the infrastructure, looking at the technology, and using some sort of technical advantage or some efficiency advantage or computing advantage to be able to regress more data more efficiently than someone else. And so there's a large opportunity on the infrastructure side to work with companies like Stats and Sports Radar to really come up with cool stuff. The second part of it, and I'm an old man when it comes to this, is esports. I get it, but I don't get it is probably the best way I could probably say that. Obviously, like, numbers don't lie in terms of people who play it. I think everyone in this room knows someone who plays StarCraft, plays Warcraft, and ignores their girlfriend for hours on end because of it. And so the numbers there, and it's clearly going down that route. So the possibility for analytics and using automation to improve play is interesting. I don't know what the data infrastructure around that is or will ever be, but clearly where money goes, efficiency sort of follows, right? And so you need to be able to optimize your performance, and I think esports is an interesting way of doing that. The last one I think is really big is the concept of virtual and augmented reality. I think that's something that is kind of taking its baby steps right now with Oculus and some other things. But that's definitely a reality, no pun intended, that we're going to have to deal with in the next couple of years. It's not something that is going to fizzle out like Google Glass or something like that. It's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with. Not deal with in a negative sense, but we're going to have to figure out how to monetize and to productize it. And so the idea of augmented reality is interesting because, like, imagine you're watching a game on a headset and you're overlaying real-time analytics about the player who's running down the field, or you're watching a hockey game and something pops up with like what the expected final score of this game would be, or there's tons of cool stuff you can do. And I think a lot of those pathways for communicating information are being built now, and they're being built concurrently with these VR companies like Oculus, like some of the other companies. So I think that's an interesting thing to get into if you're looking for sort of what's next on the tech wave.
Great. So while we're figuring out how we're going to stomach automated reality, does anybody have any questions? Do we have a mic, or what should we do?
Just yell at us, it's fine.
Yeah, you can yell at us.
So I'm 43, but when I was in my 20s, I desired to work in professional sports. And as we know, internships pay almost nothing. Sometimes entry-level positions pay just about a nickel more. I chose to leave to try to pursue just a kind of a middle-class life. And how did salary influence your decision? You talked about wanting to work for a pro team. You talked about internships. How did you kind of navigate your decision to work for a current company, and how did you just all that work in, try to create a life that pays a decent salary?
Yep. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a very difficult decision that everyone has to kind of make themselves, because the reason that teams don't pay very much to do this kind of stuff is because there's so many people who want to do it. So they know that they can go and find the next kid out of college and not really pay them. So you have to think about, and when I was thinking about this, you have to think about on a daily basis, am I going to be happy doing what I'm doing? And there are a lot of people who want to go and grind and don't really care about the money that they're making. And there are a lot of people on the other side who making the money is the most important thing to them. So that's kind of a decision that every person has to grapple with individually when it comes to that. Again, everything kind of comes down to what's going to make you as an individual happiest, which is more important to you. And to me, what I have always said is I want to be happy doing what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. I don't want it to feel like work. And in working for numberFire and getting to choose the projects that I've been able to work on, I don't really feel like I've worked very much over the last 4 or 5 years because I'm doing what, if I could do anything, I would be doing that anyway.
Yeah, so Nick, you mentioned that with companies that are like version 1 companies, essentially like ActiveScore, and then there's a version 2, and they keep going on. So how can you keep your company relevant, or let's say move your company from a 2.0 to 3.0?
Yeah. It's difficult, right? I mean, it's one of those things where I think you always have to go to conferences like this and understand what the next wave is. You have to really build your company to maintain that same hunger you had when you were starting, right? You can't get complacent, you can't get lazy. And I think even as we transition to being owned by FanDuel, we've retained a lot of the same startup mechanics, the crazy ass hours, and that's sort of just the way that we approach it. And so you have to keep an eye on what's going on in technology. You have to hire great people like Heath who know what's going on, and you just have to sort of maintain that fire to the extent that you can. And it's not easy, right? For the same reason why a team that wins a championship, the next season they may be taking it easy because they ever got one in the bag. You have to fight against that, and you have to just sort of really pay attention to what's going on and just kind of fight through it the best you can.
All right, I think we got time for one more. I saw a hand in the back.
We got two.
Two, okay.
Two.
Two more. I'm overruled now.
Just talk fast.
Anyone?
Bueller?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's half comment, half question.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting when you're talking about just starting out, like what to pick, startup versus not startup. And I think, given that we're at the data analytics conference, a lot of people might read the risk equation wrong. They think of it as like startup, high risk, hard reward versus, middle class lifestyle. But you're placing your life in the hands of another company with another set of executives who may or may not make the right decisions, may or may not value your job. Where when I look at you guys, you took your destiny in your own hands and decided to make something with it, and probably had a lot more control over
Yeah, that's.
a few years over every single day. You knew whether you were going to make it or not. Like you were part of driving that. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, some people, and I'm probably in that bucket, just don't really work well for other people, right? It's going to be something where I think you have to sort of manage that level of sort of what you want to work on and how you want to handle it. I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat it and say that there weren't a lot of hard times, so to speak. I mean, it was hard for us to raise money. It was hard for us to figure out how to build a legitimate business around it. It was hard for us to gain an audience. I mean, these are all hard things. But me personally, I'd rather do the hard things knowing that I completely own it, and if it is successful, then I share that success with the guys that I worked with versus having it dispersed out through this large company in which you don't have any ownership of it.
But it's high risk in the sense that you don't necessarily have a brand yet to work with to convince people to trust you. So for me, one of the biggest moments that we had throughout all of numberFire was when we signed a deal with ESPN for the first time because we had talked to lots of other companies, and signing the deal with ESPN was obviously great revenue-wise, but the bigger deal was that ESPN, the biggest name in sports, trusted us, and then we could kind of use that as a springboard moving forward.
Yeah.
So that was a huge deal to give us legitimacy and credibility, was being able to work with the people at ESPN.
Yeah, and one quick last point to that, when it comes to hiring and the people that we look for at numberFire, I would rather take someone who did something on their own or went to a startup and failed versus someone who went to like Yahoo or Google and just had like an okay time, right? Because the person that went to that startup and went for it and had the balls to go and do it, that person has been through the fire a little bit, and he's been to war, and he understands what it takes, and he understands the drive. And I think someone like Mark Cuban would probably agree with that too, right? It's one of those things where I think if you have the ability to do it and you have the opportunity to do it when you're young, it's a great sort of crucible. And it's a great way for you to be exposed to a bunch of different technologies, a bunch of just things you wouldn't otherwise learn at a big company around, how to work with enterprise partners and how to build audiences and different technologies and everything else. And so the people that we see who come from startups, even if they failed, we put a very high premium on that because those people are flexible and those people just are the kind of employees that we want at numberFire.
All right, I think we're out of time, right?
Sorry.
We're out of time. Thank you, guys.